The arrest of a shadow. The night bled quietly into dawn, cold and bruised, over the edge of the old harbor district. Wind scraped through the alleyways like a whisper looking for someone to blame, and there, curled against the frostbitten bricks of a forgotten storefront, slept a man who no longer dreamed. Gabriel Costa had once carried codes and blood on his hands, but now he cradled only a torn wool blanket and the bitter taste of waking up alive again. He didn't remember the name of the street he lay on, but he remembered the names of every man who had died on foreign soil under his watch. The metal clack of a police baton tapping a trash bin shattered the brittle silence. Gabriel's eyes opened like old hinges. Two uniforms stood over him, young, armed, and unsure whether they were dealing with a criminal or a ghost. One of them, Officer Reyes, recoiled slightly at the gaunt, unshaven face before him. "Sir," he said, not unkindly, "you can't sleep here." Gabriel blinked, the fog in his mind retreating just enough for his instincts to stiffen his back. He made no move to rise. "This is private property," the second officer added, his voice firmer. "You're trespassing." A long silence fell. Gabriel looked past them, not at them. Through them, as if they were windows to a world he had long ago stepped out of. "I wasn't bothering anyone," he said finally. His voice was gravel, slow, reluctant, as if each word cost him a breath of memory. "No one said you were," Reyes replied. But they were already following protocol, and Gabriel was already beyond convincing. His arrest was not dramatic. No resistance. No plea. He simply stood, gathering his blanket like it was a fallen flag, and walked between them, slow and silent. No one would know that he had once moved through war zones with the weight of a dozen lives in his hands. No one would see the medals long since pawned, the coded scars beneath the fabric of a coat that had outlived its worth. The holding cell was fluorescent and soulless. Gabriel sat like a statue of weariness, watching the corners of the room as if they might open into some other place, perhaps a jungle, perhaps a battlefield, or perhaps a childhood street he no longer trusted as real. A clerk asked him his name. He said it with the calm of a man saying goodbye. "Gabriel Costa." She typed it. The machine paused. A system hesitated. Somewhere, deep within the buried vaults of military archives, a forgotten flag twitched. But in this room, it meant nothing. They booked him for criminal trespass and set a court date no one expected would matter. Just another old man lost in the tide of a city that eats its own memories. But memory, like war, has its own clock. And its own weapons. The judge and the ghost of the past. Judge Eliana Marquez had long since learned the art of silencing her soul. It was the first requirement of the robe, to observe, to decide, but never to feel too much. Courtroom 6B was her sanctuary and her prison, its walls lined not with books, but with unspoken burdens. When she walked in, flanked by time and protocol, she was no longer a woman, no longer a mother, no longer the daughter of a man who died in a war that never made the history books. She was the law. The morning's docket was already heavy. Minor offenses, small crimes wrapped in human stories, shoplifting, disorderly conduct, possession. She heard them all with the steady voice of measured mercy. And then the name came across her screen, typed in, unassuming like any other. Gabriel Costa. She froze. Only for a second. Only long enough for the old wounds to breathe. She had not heard that name in over 30 years, but she had not forgotten it. As a child, she had stood at her grandfather's knee, listening to stories of the shadows behind the headlines. Of a man named Costa who had gone where others refused, who had whispered into war and walked away with silence strapped to his back. A man both feared and forgotten. She looked up as he entered the courtroom, flanked by two officers who barely masked their indifference. The man before her was not the myth. He was weathered, pale beneath the overhead lights, his eyes sunken but alert, watching everything as if it might vanish at any moment. He looked like a man who had survived something worse than time. "Mr. Costa," she said, her voice quieter now, her posture leaning forward slightly. "You've been charged with trespassing on private property." Do you understand the charge against you? He nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Do you have representation? No, a pause. Don't need one. A clerk scribbled. A gavel tapped lightly, not in judgment, but as a reminder of routine. Eliana's mind was not on routine. She was looking at the way his hands fidgeted under the table, thumb to knuckle, knuckle to palm like muscle memory fighting ghosts. I see here that you're a veteran, Mr. Costa, she said carefully. Can you confirm that? He looked at her now for the first time, and in his gaze there was something that stopped the breath in her throat. Recognition, not of her, but of her purpose. He knew what kind of person asked a question like that. Someone with an old photo in a drawer. Someone who still lit candles for men who never came home. Yes, he said. Long time ago. She tapped the edge of her pen against the desk, once, twice. Then she said something no one in the courtroom expected. This court will hold sentencing in recess, pending further inquiry. I'd like to request a psychological evaluation for Mr. Costa under the Veteran Compassion Consideration Act. There was a murmur. The court officer beside her stiffened. But she didn't flinch.
She didn't blink.
Gabriel tilted his head. You think I'm crazy? He asked softly. Not angry. Just curious. I think you've carried more than any man should have to, she replied. A stillness settled between them, something deeper than silence. The past had reached through time and found them both, her in her judgment, him in his surrender. When they led him away, he didn't look back.
She did.
Just once. At the door he passed through. Later that day, in her chambers, she pulled out an old file from the locked drawer beneath her desk. A faded manila envelope marked classified. Inside was a photo of a man standing beside a military vehicle, unshaven and laughing, his arm around another soldier who was half in shadow. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the man's face with her eyes. Her father had called him the Shadow Walker, the man who went where death lived and came back with stories no one wanted to hear. Now, the shadow had returned, not to haunt, but to ask, silently, if there was still space in the world for the broken. And she, Eliana Marquez, judge of the forgotten, daughter of memory, was not yet ready to answer. The gravedigger of truth. There are men who chase power, and there are those who chase justice. But Elias Kern chased ghosts, ghosts dressed in flesh and lies, buried beneath layers of time and silence. He called himself a journalist, but he knew better. He was a gravedigger of truth, and the dead he unearthed weren't always ready to be found. He had been following the Costa story for months, long before the old man's name surfaced in a courtroom again. The world had nearly forgotten Gabriel Costa, but Elias hadn't. He remembered the rumors, the stray reports lost in redacted lines and closed-door hearings. He remembered the trembling voice of an ex-informant who'd once whispered, Costa didn't just follow orders. He buried what the world couldn't face. That phrase had clung to Elias like smoke. So when the docket report leaked from a sympathetic clerk and the name, Gabriel Costa, reappeared, this time linked to a trespassing charge outside an abandoned government compound, Elias knew the truth had started to move again. He drove 10 hours through rain and aching silence to the rust-belt edge of a forgotten town, where the compound sat like a scar across the land, barbed wire curled like punctuation around concrete ruins. The place had once been called Site 17. Now it was just a ghost of steel and silence, watched over by tired crows and secrets that had grown teeth. Elias climbed the fence under moonlight, boots crunching through gravel soaked with time. The building was more ruin than refuge, but it spoke to him in rust and whispers. He found remnants, old files, blackened by fire, some scrawled with codes and dates. But what caught him wasn't paper. It was blood. Faint stains. Recent. And beside it, a small badge, military issue, snapped in half. His breath caught. Costa had been here, recently. This wasn't random trespass. This was pilgrimage. Elias's mind churned. What was he looking for?
Redemption?
Proof? Or a way to vanish properly, this time without witnesses? The next day, Elias visited the courthouse. He watched the security footage of the hearing on a monitor in a half-lit office. And when he saw her, Judge Eliana Marquez, his instincts flared. The pause in her voice when she said Costa's name. The way her gaze didn't just examine, it remembered. He started digging into her past. Not because he distrusted her, but because he recognized her. The children of the cold years carried a certain weight in their posture, like they knew how stories were twisted by silence. He found her father's name buried in a forgotten intelligence roster. He'd served. And not just served, he'd led the kind of missions no one spoke of. Missions men like Costa survived with scars no medal could decorate. Elias began to understand something far deeper than journalism. This was no longer about exposing a man's past. This was about the soul of a generation trying to bury its guilt beneath sealed files and folded flags. But truth didn't stay buried. It clawed upward, through flesh and memory, demanding to be named. That night, Elias returned to his motel room and wrote. Not a report, not an article, a confession. Not his own, but Costa's, pieced together from whispers, fragments, and blood. A story no court would admit, but one the world needed. In it, Costa wasn't a criminal. He was a witness, one whose silence had been purchased with exile. He had done things, terrible things, in the name of country and obedience. But worse than the deeds were the truths he'd buried to protect men in suits who never touched a battlefield. And the trespassing? It wasn't a mistake. It was the return to a grave he had dug with orders. Elias ended the piece with a single line that stayed with him long after he'd shut his laptop. When the war ends, the war inside begins, and some men never come home from it. The next morning, he slid the draft into an envelope and sent it to Judge Eliana Marquez, anonymously. He knew she'd read it. And when she did, she would face not just Costa's truth, but her own. Because the ghosts they both chased weren't strangers. They were family. The truth echoes in silence. The letter arrived without warning. A simple envelope, unmarked, resting like a whisper atop Judge Eliana Marquez's morning files. At first, she thought it was another legal brief, one of the countless motions and procedural echoes that filled her days. But when she opened it and saw the name Gabriel Costa at the top of the manuscript, typed, not printed, something in her chest locked tight. She read the first sentence, then the second, and then she forgot to breathe. The room around her dissolved. Walls, windows, light, all vanished into the margins of memory. Because the words she was reading weren't words, they were wounds. Carefully reopened. Purposefully placed. The writer, whoever he was, had unearthed truths buried so deep she had spent her entire adult life pretending they didn't exist. She remembered the name Costa from childhood in the way one remembers thunder, not as a fact, but as a force. Her father had spoken it only once, in a voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth. If you ever hear of Gabriel Costa again, you walk the other way, he had said, eyes not on her but somewhere far, far behind her. Some debts can't be paid with time. But time had passed. Her father had died and the world had changed on the surface. The courtroom had become her cathedral, the law her shield. She had learned to speak in sentences built from evidence and precedent, not fear. And yet now, in the silence of her chambers, that old fear returned, not as panic, but as recognition. She kept reading. The confession, if it could be called that, was unflinching. Costa's story wove through jungles and black sites, orders given and regrets swallowed like stones. It wasn't an apology. It was something worse, a reckoning. Costa had seen too much, done too much, and been silenced too thoroughly to ever belong to the world again. But he had come back, not to clear his name, but to leave a trail. A final, brutal gift. Eliana finished reading. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable clarity of what came next. Justice, as she had practiced it, was about procedures. But justice, in its rawest form, was about listening, especially to those no one else would. She closed her eyes and remembered the hearing. Costa had stood there like a man already buried. Not defiant, not broken, just done. He had wanted her to see him, not as the past, as the truth. That night, she returned to the courthouse. Empty now, quiet, its corridors bathed in the sterile orange of emergency lighting. She walked past her own courtroom and instead entered the evidence room. There, in a sealed locker, was the only item recovered from Costa's trespass, a pocket-sized tape recorder, rusted at the edges, overlooked because it had no battery, no digital output. She took it home. It took her hours to find the right cassette player. She had to dig through old boxes, university days layered in dust. When she finally pressed play, the static gave way to a voice, fragile, graveled, and unmistakably his. "I'm not here to ask forgiveness," Costa said. "I've seen what forgiveness costs. I just want someone to know." He spoke in fragments. Stories that filled the gaps between the lines of the manuscript. Names she had seen on memorials, but never in tribunals. Orders that came with no signatures, only silence. And then, in the last minute, he said her father's name. Her breath stopped. He believed we were doing the right thing.
So did I.
But the right thing dies when the truth does. And we killed too much truth to ever call it justice. When the tape clicked to a stop, Eliana just sat there. No tears. No rage. Just silence, thick and heavy and utterly complete. And in that silence, something inside her cracked. Not a breaking, but an opening. The next morning, she filed a motion. Not as a judge, but as a private citizen. It was a petition to reopen a cold years inquiry closed nearly 3 decades ago, citing newly surfaced testimony and material evidence. It would cause a storm. It might ruin her. But truth, once heard, cannot be unheard. It lives in silence, waiting for someone brave or broken enough to answer. As she stood on the courthouse steps, the sun just cresting the horizon, Eliana whispered a name to herself. Not her father's, not Costa's. Her own. Because now she was the echo. And silence would no longer suffice. Belated justice. The courtroom felt colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in memory. Each bench, each polished corner of mahogany, held echoes of voices that had long since faded. Judge Eliana Marquez stood alone in the silent chamber where she had once ruled with precision, composure, and a fierce belief that truth had structure. Now, structure was a ghost, and truth was bleeding through the cracks. The petition had made headlines. Judge reopens cold years case against state protocol orders. It sparked outrage.
Praise. Fear.
The ministry called it reckless. Civil groups called it brave. Former operatives went underground. But Eliana stayed exactly where she was, under the light, under the scrutiny, beneath the weight of a decision that could shatter her career but mend something far deeper, the quiet dissonance between who she had become and who she had once dreamed of being. She remembered the day the first witness walked in. Not an old soldier, not an agent or whistleblower. A woman, thin, pale, carrying a photograph in her hand like a relic from another life. She sat on the stand, spine trembling but unbroken, and said simply, "My brother never came home. I want to know if he screamed." Eliana didn't flinch. Not anymore. The hearings rolled forward like a tide that refused to recede. With each testimony, the facades eroded. Black sites became real places. Unmarked graves were no longer rumors. Orders without names bore signatures found in newly declassified files. And in the center of it all was Gabriel Costa. Not a martyr, not a monster, but a mirror held up to a country's conscience. He never returned to court. He disappeared again, this time not as a fugitive, but as a man who had delivered what he could and chosen not to linger in the ashes.
Eliana respected that.
Some ghosts don't want redemption. Only recognition. It was in the 4th week of hearings that Eliana was handed a file marked personal copy, classified. Inside were transcripts, not of operations, but of confessions recorded by agents long after the blood had dried. It included a name she had never dared say out loud in court, her father's. His voice on the tape was younger than she remembered, but just as commanding. "We told ourselves it was war," he said. "But wars end. What we did, it kept going." Her hands had trembled then, not because of shame, but because of clarity. The kind of clarity that sears. The kind that tells you, you were not wrong to love him. But you were not wrong to expose him either. The ruling came on the 38th day. Eliana read it slowly, deliberately, each word a stake planted in contested ground. She ruled that the Cold Years operation constituted a violation of both national and international law, that the absence of accountability had caused irreparable trauma to the public trust, that survivors, families of the disappeared, and even former operatives living in silence had the right, not just to answers, but to recognition. Legal, moral, human. The courtroom was still when she finished. And then, one by one, people began to rise. Not to applaud, but to stand. A quiet, solemn protest against forgetting. Later that night, Eliana returned to her chambers alone. She poured herself a glass of water,
Sat down.
looked out the window at a city that didn't yet know how to heal, but had finally admitted it was wounded. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice, though tired, was steady. She picked up her pen and began writing a letter. Not to Costa. Not to the press. To the woman who once said, "I want to know if he screamed." Eliana wrote, "He did not scream.
But he sang.
In the end, a song without words, only breath. He died not as a number, but as a man remembered." She folded the letter. Outside, the city exhaled. Justice had come too late to save anyone, but not too late to matter. One day each year, every April 17th, the train to Calvario station fills with people who do not look at one another. Some wear black coats despite the spring sun. Some carry lilies or faded photographs, but most bring nothing, just silence, and the kind of eyes that have forgotten how to weep but remember how to stare. One day each year, they come. Not because they believe justice is finished, not because forgiveness has bloomed, but because memory, once awakened, refuses to be buried again. At the far end of the platform stands a plaque, weather-worn, modest, inscribed with names. Hundreds. Some are real, others pseudonyms, codes, references to bodies never found. Below the list, a single line. To the disappeared, who never disappeared from us. Among those who gather is Alma. She was 16 when her mother vanished into the cold years. Now she teaches philosophy at a quiet university and wears her grief like a second spine, subtle but unyielding. Each year she brings her daughter, Lucia, who asks fewer questions now, as if she has learned that some truths are too large for language. Alma does not pray, but she stands still. In stillness, she finds reverence. In silence, resistance. From a short distance, a man watches them. Gabriel Costa, older now, bearded, thinner. He does not approach. He never does. But each year, he boards the same train. He never lays a hand on the memorial, never joins the crowd. He only observes, perhaps unsure whether he is mourner or ghost. He still carries the notebook. The one where, years ago, he wrote down the names, the coordinates, the patterns he uncovered from within the system he once served. Pages now frayed, ink bleeding from time and damp. Yet, he turns to the same page every time, the one with the name Elisa F., written 4 times, each with a different last initial. He never discovered which was her real identity. Just that she sang to the other prisoners through the walls, soft lullabies in a language no one could place. He closes the notebook. Some songs are meant to be unfinished. A bell rings. The memorial begins. No speeches. Only names read aloud. One by one. No embellishments. No titles. Just names, tender and exact as scars. Eliana Marquez does not attend the memorial. But each year she pens a note. She sends it to Alma, and signed, always folded into the same plain envelope. This year's note reads, "We cannot resurrect them, but we can make the silence they left behind sacred." Alma doesn't reply. She never has. She only places the note beside the plaque, letting it rest there for the wind to decide. As dusk falls, people begin to leave. Slowly, without farewell. The train whistles. Gabriel steps onto it as always. Alma and Lucia remain a moment longer. Lucia, now 16 herself, finally asks, "Do you think they know we come?" Alma thinks of lullabies through prison walls, of names read in rain, of justice that stumbled but did not stop. She answers softly, "I think they remember the sound of our footsteps." The wind shifts. The paper flutters once, then flies. One day each year, they return, not to forget what was taken, but to offer back what was never theirs to keep. Presence, breath, the echo of names.